Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome this evening to our speaker, Professor A.C. Grayling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Have I managed to switch on the machine? As you can see, I have my anxieties about the technologies that we're flooded with these days. We live under a tsunami of technological developments, and some of us are still catching up on things like this. So, my theme tonight is proving atheism, which is a very, provocative title to have, because most people think that you can't prove either way whether there are gods and goddesses or supernatural agencies in the universe or not. And those who would like to be able to believe that there are take comfort from the supposed fact that you can't prove that there are. And I would like to, if I can, somehow upset that sense of comfort on their part by explaining how indeed you can prove. In order to do this, I must take you for a little foray, as it might be a stroll through some very important philosophical concepts. The concepts of knowledge, of truth, and of proof itself. And first, let me point out to you something which we are all, of course, actually familiar with, and that is that knowledge is, even though in philosophical terms tends to be defined very, very strictly as a belief which is not merely true but justified, so you have a complete assurance that it's true, that knowledge as defined in those very strict terms is simply not possible outside formal contexts, that's to say outside logic and mathematics, where you can achieve, especially by deductive means, complete certainty as to the outcome of a chain of reasoning. And if you can be completely certain that a conclusion has followed from premises, then you can know the conclusion, because not merely do you believe it, but you have a complete justification for it, namely the proof procedure, the logical or mathematical proof procedure, and of course it would be true on the definitions. I say true on the definitions because you must remember your reading of Alice in Wonderland. You remember when she falls down the rabbit hole, has some rather confusing experiences, like getting very big and nearly drowning in her own tears and so on. And so she says, I better do my maths tables to see if I'm all right. And so she says 5 times 7 equals 12, and 5 times 8 equals 13, and 5 times 9 equals 14. And then she says, oh dear, at this rate I'll never get to 20. And she's right, because as you know, Lutwidge Dodgson was a mathematician, and he loved to play tricks, which he does all the way through Alice in Wonderland. And because she's multiplying to a different base each time, it is true that 5 times 7 equals 12, 5 times 8 equals 13, and so on. And she can indeed not get to 20 because the series jumps when you get to 19. So that is a demonstration of the fact that if you change the axioms and definitions of a formal language, then of course you're going to get different outcomes. There will be formal languages in which 1 plus 1 might not equal 2, but in fact be 11. So you can see that in order to be satisfied of the truth, even in formal contexts of the outcome of a chain of reasoning, you have to understand the axioms and the definitions. But all that said, it remains that it is only in mathematics and logic that you can have watertight, complete certainty on the assumptions and the definitions, and therefore you can claim to have unexceptionable, indefeasible knowledge. But knowledge as we understand this in the ordinary sense, that is scientific knowledge, knowledge in encyclopedias, knowledge about how to get around Manchester. I've just learned a bit of that knowledge myself this evening with the help of GPS. That kind of knowledge is what's called defeasible knowledge, in the sense that there are circumstances in which you might have to change your view. You might learn something new, or you might be shown that something that you took as a fact, something that you could rely on, that you could use in your thinking about the world or about yourself, or which you could use as a premise in further reasoning, might have to be adjusted or changed or abandoned or replaced. If you get hold of a physicist, say a particle physicist, and ask that person, do you know anything in particle physics in the sense in which you know that 1 plus 1 equals 2? She should say, No, I don't, because we can have an extremely high degree of confidence in some set of results after very exhaustive experimental runs, and we can very safely premise this conclusion that we've reached in our further investigations. But there will always be a chance that something might come along, new evidence, better arguments, better experiments, better equipment, which will show us that we need to adjust or abandon or replace some view that we hold. The defeasibility of knowledge is a very important feature of inquiry in the case, in the empirical case, the contingent world, the world of not of formal definitions as in maths and logic, but the world of actuality and practicality. So all knowledge is defeasible. You may know that Physics Review Letters, which is one of the absolute top physics journals, regards as a discovery any result which achieves the level of probability of sigma 5, it's called, sigma 5, which means that there is only a 1 in 3.5 million chance that you've made a mistake or there's something wrong or some little gremlin has got into the system. A 1 in 3.5 million chance. But there is still a chance, and therefore you have to remain open to the possibility that revision might be necessary. And indeed, this is one of the remarkable and wonderful things about science, that it is very open-minded and open-ended and always looking to test itself and to see whether its conclusions, its theories are safe, and whether in the light of new information, new knowledge, new experimental data, it might have to revise itself. Now, you may also remember, of course, that the Higgs boson was identified back in 2012, and the results of a large number of experiments, an extremely elaborate and powerful experimental tool, the Large Hadron Collider, had detected the presence of this field, the Higgs field, at the energy levels at which the original theoretical prognostications had said they might be found. A very good friend of mine was one of the lead scientists on the compact muon solenoid experiment. You may remember there were two quite separate experiments looking for the Higgs in two very different ways, so that if they both spotted the same particle at the same energy level, then there would be a very high degree of confidence that they'd got hold of this very important part of the standard model of the atom. And the friend in question is a man called Tejinder Virdi. He's now Sir Tejinder Virdi, having been knighted for this great achievement that he and his colleagues made at the Large Hadron Collider. He won the European Physics Medal, which is the sort of physics Nobel for the European setting in science. And I said to him, golly, it must have been absolutely wonderful on the day that after so many experiments and so much analysis of the data, you felt able as a committee in Geneva to say, right, we can now publish the fact that we have found this particle. And he said, yes, it was quite nice. But if we hadn't found it, it would have been really exciting, because that would have meant that there was a lot more physics to do. And it's that sort of wonderful enthusiasm and openness and preparedness not to know and to be uncertain and to be still looking, which is very characteristic of science. Very unlike dogma with its absolute certainties, even to the point where you might be prepared to die or worse still, to kill for your absolute certainties. Now, I often point out to people that you can explain the major tenets of any religion, the major doctrines of any religion, in less than half an hour. It takes a bit longer to study physics. So you can see that the difference of mindset is a very important feature here, and it takes us back to this point about the nature of knowledge. Knowledge is defeasible. When you claim to know something, you have to have very good evidence for it, but you also have to be prepared to revise it if new and better evidence comes along. So that's what we need to say about knowledge. And immediately, that has a consequence for our concept of truth, because the relationship between the concepts of knowledge and truth is a very intimate one. When I gave you that definition, the standard philosophical definition of knowledge as justified true belief, obviously, you cannot know something which is false. You can know that it's false, but you can't say, I know this falsehood, thinking that somehow or other it's equatable with knowing a truth. So the concept of truth plays a very important role. But what I've just said about the open-endedness of science suggests, rightly, that no scientist would say, this is the truth about things. This is how things are. I have got hold of the truth about the nature of fundamental reality. On the contrary, as you know, there are all sorts of very imaginative, some wildly speculative theories about what lies beyond the standard model, beyond quantum theory, into string theory, into thinking about how we are to understand all these apparently incomprehensible ideas of superposition, entanglement, and uncertainty, and so on. And these are imaginings, very controlled and very disciplined and well-informed imaginings, about the possibilities of the nature of nature. And there, what the inquirers are seeking to do is to get as close to the truth of things as they can. And that means that they're treating the concept of truth as an ideal, as a point in the distance, as it were, of inquiry, on which they hope to converge. They hope that different ways of examining this problem, different experimental and theoretical efforts, will bring us closer and closer to what might be regarded as the truth about things, always, however, accepting that what seems to be the truth about something may turn out to be only a staging post towards that ideal. So the concept of truth becomes an ideal of inquiry, something that we wish to aim for. And instead of thinking that there might be something which is the truth of a given matter, I mean, apart from things like, it is true that you are sitting here now looking at somebody waving his arms around and so on, so you think, oh, I've got a sense of truth in that respect. But then, of course, you have to remember our friend René Descartes, who said, you may be asleep and dreaming or having a nightmare that you're in a philosophy lecture, therefore you can't claim to have the truth about it. And it's quite possible that somebody is asleep and dreaming in this audience at this very moment. Of course, you know the old story about the man who dreamt that he was giving a speech in the House of Lords and woke up and found that he was. Well, that is a kind of proof of the Cartesian possibility. So truth is an ideal of inquiry, but it does give rise to some very, very important associated ideas. The idea of being truthful, of being intellectually honest, of intellectual integrity, the idea of trying to cleave to the truth or to find the truth or to aim one's inquiries at the truth is what it is to be truthful. It's an interesting fact, that the word true, etymologically, comes from an Anglo-Saxon word, which denotes the flight of an arrow. So, we talk about something running true, running straight, going straight to the target. That's where the idea of truth comes from. And therefore, from the point of view of the, as it were, the convergence concept, the idea of truth as an ideal of inquiry, of trying to get the right aim, trying to find the right target, and to run straight and true to that target. And that's where the idea of truthfulness, of truth-likeness, of being as intellectually honest as one can be, becomes important. So now let me turn to the concept of proof itself, already mentioned in the case of the formal languages of mathematics and logic. And there the idea of proof, which is the idea that far too many people export into the contingent or empirical realm, is a very straightforward one. So I give you a syllogism. Syllogism is an argument with two premises and a conclusion. A very familiar one. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, one thing you will notice about that is that the conclusion of that argument is just a rearrangement of the terms in the premises. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You just switched the words around to get your conclusion. And this is how it is with deductions. Deductions are always such that the information in the conclusion is already contained in the premises. You've all seen, in the detective films and TV series and so on, the detective pins up all the suspects and murder victims and the places and times up onto a board and looks at them. But because all the answer is there, the answer is present in the information, and it just has to be rearranged and made visible. The conclusion is there already. That's the whole point of that process of trying to deduce from the premises the conclusion. There is therefore never any logical novelty, as the point is often made. There's no logical novelty in a deduction. All the information and conclusion is already in the premises, but there can, however, be psychological novelty. So a very, very long, complicated deduction might pop out a very surprising conclusion, as is the case with the detective with everything pinned up on the board. The actual murderer might be a very surprising result. There's a nice story usually told in this context of a duke. Notice that he's a French duke, not a duke. And he has a weekend party, and the guest of honor at the weekend party is a cardinal who regales the assembled company with a story to entertain them while the duke has popped out to get a bit more Chateauneuf du Pape or whatever it is they're drinking that evening. And he tells them that when he was a young curé, first ordained, his very, very, very first person who came to have confession with him was a vile, multiple murderer of the worst conceivable kind. Say the assembled company. The Duke returns, claps the cardinal on the shoulder, says, "I've known the cardinal for ages, In fact, I was the very first person." So, all the guests leave. They're all a logician to a man and a woman. They all jump into their coaches and off they go. So you can see plenty of psychological novelty there, but no logical novelty because just the rearrangement of the information. But in the empirical case, the contingent case, the case of the world as it is, the case of the world of actuality, we have very, very few opportunities to deduce. And most of our reasonings are inductive of one kind or another. Inductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning which goes from a sample, from a bit of evidence, and extrapolates or draws out a probability or a more general conclusion than is warranted by the premises, strictly speaking. It may very well be warranted if it's a very well-controlled and thought-out induction. So, for example, we see pollsters will take usually about 1,300 or so people, selected from different social classes and economic levels and so forth, and then they ask them how they're going to vote, and then they give us a proportion of support for one political party or another. They're extrapolating from a controlled sample to the whole set. And there, to some degree, that there is a rough kind of measure of accuracy, although, of course, people lie to pollsters and in the last minute change their votes and so on. So there is a degree of inaccuracy which they allow for. They always give a kind of error margin in there. But that's an example of controlled inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is always, to a much larger degree, uncertain because of the conditions that affect how safe the extrapolation is from the sample to the whole. Now, your expectation that a bus will come when you're waiting at the bus stop, or that you'll get wet if you don't take an umbrella on a rainy day, all these expectations are inductive expectations. And this is where things get interesting. Because what you notice about our behavior, about our thinking and acting on the basis of inductive inferences, it says something about how responsible we're being to the grounds that we have for our induction. For example, supposing you look out of the window one morning and it's bucketing down with rain, and it's said on the weather report that it's going to rain all day. But you think to yourself, well, I was reading David Hume in bed last night, and he points out that inductive inferences are very, very unsafe. The fact that the sun has risen every morning for millions of years is no guarantee that it's going to rise tomorrow morning. In fact, Bertrand Russell has a rather different and better example. He says, think of the chicken which is fed every day and protected from the fox and so on. The chicken thinks to itself, my word, life is pretty good actually, and it can only get better until the day that he is Sunday lunch. Well, there's an example of how very, very unreliable inductive inferences can be, because indeed, no matter how often things have happened in the past, they may not happen again in the future. So you, reflecting on this, decide, well, I have got wet every time I've been in the rain without an umbrella in the past, but maybe it won't happen this time. So I'm not going to take my umbrella. As you stagger about the street sopping wet, what are your neighbors going to think of you? They're going to think you're an Egypt. And why? Because you have failed to match your expectations and your actions to the evidence that you've accumulated in the past. What you failed to do is you have failed to be rational. Now look at that word, rational. First part of that word is ratio, and ratio means proportion. So your conclusion, your judgment, your decision about how to act must be proportional to the evidence that you have in favor of it. This is why the belief that there are fairies at the bottom of your garden is irrational, because you have no, but scarcely any evidence in favor of it, and a great deal of evidence against it. And therefore, to proportion your belief in there being fairies on the garden to the evidence that you have would result in you saying, no, there aren't, and I'm not going to act as if there are. I'm not going to predicate anything on that. My thinking is not going to involve any fairy dust or fairy possibilities. Rationality, the proportioning of evidence to judgment, to what you accept, and to how you act. And this is absolutely key. So bear that in mind. Now let us go back to the concept of proof itself. In the contingent and empirical case, proof means test. If you go to a steel foundry, you will notice that every 100 or 1,000 or whatever it might be, rods or sheets of steel that are produced in a rolling mill will be taken out, and once cooled, they will be loaded to see at what point they will fracture, how much loading they will take before they fracture. This is called proving the steel, testing the steel. You've heard the saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So the test of the pudding, whether the pudding has worked okay, whether it tastes all right, and so on, whether it's just like your grandma did it. That proof of the pudding is in the eating. The exception that proves the rule. Now, of course, most people, not really understanding the meat of the concept of proof here, thinks that if there's an exception to the rule, then it has validated the rule. On the contrary, what that phrasing means, exception proves the rule, is that an exception will show the limit of application of the rule, how far the rule works and when it ceases to work. So the exception that proves the rule, tests the rule, shows how well the rule works or how far it works. So in the empirical contingent case, proof means test. And this is how you can prove that there are no gods, goddesses, supernatural beings or agencies in or associated with the universe. By the way, you notice I use this rather elaborate formula. It's because when my youngest daughter was very little, I said to her, look, I said to my then wife, I said, look, everybody in this country is exposed to so much religion, prayers and hymns at school and church, Easter and Christmas and so on. I'm determined now, with this last of our children, to bring her up an atheist. And my wife said, oh my God, that means she's going to be a Mother Abbess when she grows up, because you know what children are like. Anyway, so I thought I would give it a shot. And I said to her, when you get into discussions with other people, other children at school and so on, don't talk about God with a capital G as if it's a name, because there isn't anything it names. It's just an empty thing. Talk about gods and goddesses. So you can say, well, I don't believe in gods and goddesses. Why do you? And then people will say, well, I don't believe in gods and goddesses. I mean, if there's one God. And you say, well, what's your evidence for that? If there's one, why can't there be an infinite number of them? And at any rate, most religious traditions have got a plurality of them, even, in fact, Christianity, because by a kind of theological arithmetic. We managed to get several of them involved. And also, if you ever, those of you who were Catholics, or perhaps still are, will know that Catholicism, of course, is a goddess-worshipping faith, a Mariolatrist faith. I've been astonished, actually, walking around some European cities recently and going to very, very, very beautiful churches, Baroque churches, and noticing that the central figure above the altar is Mary. And the iconography in the church is mainly, Mary. Jesus is a kind of sort of also ran. He figures mainly as a baby, actually, which is sort of quite harmless in a way, and occasionally as a torture-fiction. But you do see this concentration on Mary. And you remember Fraser of Golden Bough fame gave a reason for this, which is that when at the end of the 4th century, the church became was pronounced to be when Christianity was pronounced to be the official religion of the Roman Empire by Theodosius I in the Edict of Thessalonica, 380 AD. You all know this, you were reading about it just last night. When that happened, the church undertook a sort of campaign to achieve mass conversion. One thing they did, and you can read about this in Catherine Nixie's book, The Darkening Age, of how they destroyed as much of the literature of classical antiquity as they could and smashed as many statues and temples as they could. But also by saying to people, you know, the gods that you worshipped here in your local area, actually they're saints of the church. And in particular, the great center of worship of Diana, the virgin goddess, at Aritzia in Italy, was said by the church, in fact, we can now tell you her real name is Mary. The virgin goddess is Mary. And Mary has been a great focus of worshipful attention in Catholicism ever since. So that's, a way to do it. So you might argue that, in fact, not even Christianity itself is quite as Unitarian as it might be. Anyway, this is what I said to my little daughter. By the way, she said to me one day, she was about 7 or 8, she said, Daddy, I don't believe in gods and goddesses, but I do believe in the tooth fairy. And I said, well, you've got evidence in favor of the existence of the tooth fairy, haven't you? Because every time you lose a tooth, you get £1. There is a tooth fairy. Happens to be me, but there is one, and you've got the evidence for it. So that was a very heartwarming moment. So, gods and goddesses, I always use that phrase because it shows the burden of the argument. So how do you go about saying to somebody, well, let us test the claim that there are gods and goddesses or supernatural agencies of some kind in the universe? And here I cite a very well-known example, you probably know it, Carl Sagan's Dragon in the Garage. You've all perhaps come across that and read it. And it goes like this. Somebody says to you, I've got a dragon in my garage. And you say, ooh, I'd love to see a dragon. And he says, oh, well, this one is invisible. So you say, okay, but we can hear its leathery wings flapping, can't we? No, this one is silent. So you say, okay, let's put talcum powder on the floor of the garage and we can see its dragony footprints. No, this one never lands on the floor of the dragon. Okay, how about we feel its hot breath? No, this one doesn't have hot breath, it's got cool breath, etc., etc. What you're doing is you're testing the claim that there's a dragon in the garage. You're testing the claim. Just as you test an iron steel rod, prove the steel rod, so you were trying to show what would satisfy any rational person who's going to proportion evidence to judgment that there is a dragon in the garage. You can come up with all sorts of experiments, you can come up with all sorts of tests for this, and if the claim fails those tests, if there is nothing whatever that will meet even ordinary levels of requirement for a claim to pass a test, you can regard it as being irrational to accept that there is a dragon in the garage. Now let's circle back. So just keep that in mind. We circle back now to claims about knowledge and truth. And notice that when we talk in our normal colloquial way about knowing something, that an encyclopedia contains a lot of knowledge, or that we know we're all in Manchester at the moment, but it's defeasible. Unbeknownst to us, we might have been raptured up by some aliens into a spaceship as we stood here, so we might not be in Manchester. Even that very remote possibility has to be allowed. You might think that means, well, that's the remote possibility that there are gods and goddesses. But neither of those remote possibilities are rational to believe, because they don't sit with the evidence for them. So when we circle back to the concept of knowledge, we notice that what we can claim to know is what it is rational to assert. Rational because we have a sufficient degree of evidence or cogency of argument that supports that claim. Right, so there is a way of proving that there are no supernatural agencies in or associated with the universe. That is, testing claims to that effect. Because anybody who asserts such a claim has a burden of proof, a burden of justification, a burden to provide us with the kind of evidence that would be sufficient for us to think twice, or perhaps to accept the view that there are. Notice that the concept of the burden of proof means the burden of providing a degree of evidence that would be suasive. So the word persuasion, so a suasive degree of evidence that would make you think, well, there is a degree of probability that is worth taking seriously, or maybe I should revise my view about the universe. But if there is a very, very, very little such evidence, then it is irrational to believe it. But there is a further step that we need to take here when we are proving that there are no testing the claim that there are supernatural agencies, proving that there are not, okay? And that further step is to put those claims into context. Let's go back to fairies. You may know that fairies were very, very, very widely believed in until the early 20th century. I mean, people thought that fairies were responsible for your missing shoelaces and for curdling the milk and for pinching you in the middle of the night and so on. And people thought they even saw them. I mean, famously, there were some people who doctored some photographs of fairies, you may remember. Nobody took that seriously. But people thought that, little lights across the marshes, will-o'-the-wisp or whatever, thought of these as being non-natural or supernatural entities of some kind. And there was a great deal of lore, L-O-R-E, of tradition, of teaching, of stories about them and what they did. So there was a whole tradition there. Just as there was for many, many, many centuries, and so several millennia anyway, belief that the heavenly bodies, the stars, sun, moon, planets, and so on, influenced us in our character, in which part of the year we were born in, and which stars, and from them we could infer things about the future and so on. And there's a whole elaborate science of astrology. In fact, a number of different astrological schools with very elaborate theories, with a whole structure of argumentation about why a given juxtaposition of planets in the configuration of the heavens would have this effect rather than that effect, and so on. And mainly, although people, of course, mainly still do look at their horoscope whenever they're feeling a bit miserable, hope that things will be better next month, and so on. Mainly, acceptance of claims in astrology have vanished in the more educated parts of the world, and belief in fairies and sprites and so on, likewise, has faded away. But the probative value, that is the amount of evidence, belief, and support for them, both astrology and belief in fairies and pixies and gnomes, was very, very considerable. There were whole bodies of belief and story and legend and literature supporting these things. They've fallen away for a variety of reasons. One is, I know that there were two major reasons why schooling became much more widespread in England in the 19th century. The church was anxious to combat superstition, so brackets, close brackets. And the superstition in question, of course, being belief in fairies, so they wanted to combat that. And the state was prepared to support that endeavor because they wanted literate or people who could add and subtract and so on to be good foot soldiers in the economic army, to be able to work in shops and factories and so on. Those are the two main reasons for the beginning of schools. But that one, which was about combating superstition, is a very interesting one, and is one of the explanations as to why a generalized belief in the little people faded away. Hasn't completely faded away. There's the famous story, isn't there, of the Irish lady who's asked if she believes in leprechauns, and she says, I do not, but they're there anyway. So, I mean, that kind of that kind of belief sort of lingers in the back of people's minds. But when you push that, when you challenge somebody on a belief of that kind, and you make them think about the question of evidence, about how rational the belief is, how proportioned it is to all the considerations that you can adduce, you find that the degree of conviction fades away. You put the religious traditions into the context of the great history of human endeavor to think about the world and to make sense of the world. Let me put the point this way. I'm very keen to argue in the educational context that religious studies, isn't it, some of us will remember how they used to be called religious instruction, RI, in schools? Just think of that. Anyway, religious studies now, much more, we've got to be much more open-minded and have more than one religion to study and so on. But religious studies, think of the great tapestry of human efforts to make sense of our world and ourselves. All the mythologies and different religions, the attempts at science, the philosophies, the rich material that has come out of literature to explore the human condition. And out of this rich tapestry, to pull out one thread, which is the story of religions, and to study them independently of the great tapestry of which this thread is part, is to give it a very, very undue salience, to make it important in a way that it isn't really. Because if you just left the thread in place of the tapestry, you would see that, over to the left of the tapestry here, there are lots of mythologies and religions and so on, and they kind of fade out until we come to what is functionally a very secular kind of world and way of thinking about the world in more recent times. Because you have to, if you look at the history of religions, you notice that they begin as an attempt to try to make sense of the world. They're a kind of proto-science by attributing agency to the forces of nature. That the thunder is caused by a deity or a big version of me walking on the clouds, or the wind is some invisible agency puffing up its cheeks and going like that. And then as our forebears got to know the world a bit better and began to notice natural regularities and variations, so all these agencies, the nymphs, the dryads in the trees and streams, the gods in the, under the sea and in the earth, they all kind of moved away, mainly to mountaintops, actually. That's where Moses met his God and where the Olympians were. And then when people got to the top of mountains, and there weren't very many gods there, the gods were all, by decreasing in number, by the way, because they used to be everywhere, and then they became 12, and then they became 1, and then out into outer space. And when people discovered that the world is round, so no way is up, that was a bit more complicated. So then the last remaining deity just left space and time altogether. So there's a whole process there. Those strands of the tapestry have resulted in just very, very few gods left, maybe 1 or 3 or something, and not in space and time, and not encounterable or understandable, because, of course, the great argument left to theologians after you've tested and tested and tested and proved and challenged and asked them for the evidence and asked them for the consistency between the idea of a good God and all the moral and natural evil in the world, when you've pushed and pushed, they say, our finite minds are incapable of understanding the infinite, and God is ineffable. This is a tremendous, now the tapestry is turned into a carpet under which you can sweep, all your inability to stand up against the testing, the proving that the challenge of rational inquiry poses. So to prove atheism, I've just had a signal about the time, to prove atheism is to test the claims of religion. And to test is to look for the degree of rationality, the degree of proportionality to evidence that you have, always remembering to put, not just claims about miracles and encounters with the divine and so on in the remnant of the religious traditions that we have now, but put it into its historical context, put it alongside talk about fairies and the influence of the stars on our destiny. Put it into that same context. And then ask yourself, why is it that religion should still hold a claim on so many people when fairies and astrology don't? And of course the answer is it's institutionalized. And we have great religious organizations. They are very influential in society. It's only very recently in history, in the last century or so, that the significance of religious organizations in the Anglophone world, for example, or the Eurocentric world, has diminished, and it is still extremely powerful in Muslim-majority countries, in India. And so you can see that the institutionalization is what keeps people thinking that it is rational to believe those things, even though they no longer see that it is rational to believe in astrology or in fairies. And a final concluding point. So we have atheist societies. It's a very, very great honor to be the honorary president of it. And atheism has become a thing. So there are atheists, and there is atheism, which makes it sound as though it's a set of doctrines. And as you know, it isn't. In fact, the word atheist is a theist's word. Now, theists have described people who don't sign up for their way of thinking about things as those who are sort of non-believers. Some of you here would have heard me liken this situation to the attitude of people who collect stamps to people who don't. So stamp collectors, I don't know, if stamp collecting was incredibly important to stamp collectors, they would regard people who don't collect stamps as stamp collectors. And maybe even in the past, these stamp collectors would have been burned at the stake, or stamped on, or something horrible would have happened to them. But that's pretty well what it's like. So atheists are people who don't collect stamps. It doesn't. If you're an atheist, it doesn't follow anything else. Doesn't follow from that fact. If you're a theist, certain things do follow from that, because you can legitimately ask of a theist, well, which form of theism? There are plenty, and how many gods do you believe in, and so on. But if you're an atheist, there's nothing more to be said. You just don't. You're just not at that party. So people sometimes can, you've heard people describe Richard Dawkins as a militant atheist. It's just not possible to be militantly somebody who doesn't collect stamps. I mean, how do you do that? You don't collect stamps. Well, you can see that that's the wrong expression. Christopher Hitchens was self-described himself not just as an atheist, but an anti-theist. Now, you can be a militant anti-theist because you can be very cross with those theists who want to impose their views on other people and kill them if they don't agree and so on. You can certainly be a militant anti-theist. You can be a militant secularist, wanting to drive the religious voice out of the public square. You can't really be a militant humanist, can you? I mean, after all, humanism is a non-religious ethical outlook which tries to think about what our values should be, how we should relate to one another, how we should live our lives. So you can be an enthusiast, I suppose, for the humanist view and want to show people, because very often, you get people who say, well, if you're going to give up on religion, what's going to provide meaning in life? You can say there's this wonderful, long-standing, goes all the way back to classical antiquity and before, a very rich, humane view, humanism, which is, that we, as Emerson said, we give other people the same advantage that we give a painting, which is the advantage of a good light. We try to treat them with sympathy and generosity and understanding, and it's only when they turn out to be mean and selfish and nasty and so on that we don't accept that. So, that you can't really be a militant humanist, because humanists are just too nice to be militant about anything. So you can be a militant secularist and a militant anti-theist, but you cannot be a militant atheist. And atheism just denotes a space, the space where your thinking, your attitude to the world, your set of beliefs and so on is not predicated on the idea that there's supernatural agency is in one or another way involved in our world. And when you think about it, you think about the idea that there is an invisible policeman who watches you all the time, even when you're on your own at night in bed, you know, you're being watched. I don't know whether you know that thing, George Carlin's great thing about people who believe there's an invisible man in the sky who watches everything you do. And if you don't do what he says, he's got a list of things you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And if you don't conform to that list, then he's going to send you into hellfire and you're going to burn there forever. But he loves you. And he wants your money, as George Carlin said. Anyway, so you put it into context, and then you notice the power, because it is a very powerful idea of proof as test, of testing the rationality of these claims, and why it is just straightforwardly irrational to believe that there are fairies in the garden, that there are nymphs and dryads in the trees and streams, that there are gods, 12 of them on Olympus, or one somewhere outside space and time, whatever that means. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. Have I turned this on? No, I haven't. Oh dear, oh dear. Don't go away, technologies. Are you sure? I'm showing red. Yeah, okay, you want? Could I have the first question, please? We don't have a lot of time for Q&A tonight. I'm so sorry. Put your hand up now if you have a question.
This gentleman was there.
So...
Oh, by the way, sorry, could I impose something on you, which is that there are empirical studies which show that if the first question is asked by a woman, that other women in the audience will feel empowered to ask questions as well. And so now to be affirmative, could I please have a lady to ask the first question?
So,
What empirical study was that?
That's a very good question. Yes, we should dig that up. And next time somebody asks me that, I'm going to come out with the answer. But thank you. Perfect.
Another question, please.
Now, that gentleman there was second.
Where?
Yes.
What?
That
gentleman there?
Yeah. With the Welshman, I think he must be.
Some people would claim that to prove God exists on a priori, necessary, logical basis, the ontological argument, and things like that. It is a bizarre proof, the ontological. What's your favourite way of demolishing it?
Well, but by showing that it also proves that there can't be a devil in the following way. So the ontological argument says there is something which is the greatest or the most perfect thing in the universe. A most perfect thing which actually exists is more perfect than one that doesn't exist. Therefore, the most perfect being in the universe exists. Now, unfortunately for this argument, the most perfect thing in the universe could be a very imperfect thing, just less imperfect than anything else. So it would still be the most perfect thing. The most perfect thing in the universe could very well be in this room right now, one of you. Even though you might be, pretty imperfect, just the rest of us might be worse. So the argument doesn't establish anything. For example, somebody is the tallest person in Manchester. Somebody is. And if there are two people who are equally tall, then whichever one of them got up latest today, because as you know, gravity makes you short, is the tallest person in Manchester. Okay, so just using the superlative doesn't establish anything. If you read Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason, he has a wonderful destruction of the argument in saying that existence cannot be a property of things. So you can't say of the deity that the deity has all these properties in perfection, and one of the properties has to be existence. If I said to you, this lectern belongs to the free... where are we? The what?
Friends Meeting House.
Friends Meeting House, and it is made of metal, and it doesn't exist, then you would be a bit puzzled by that, because I would have denied one property of it while attributing others. So all those reasons, this is a really, really, really bad argument. But my favorite one, as you asked for, is this. There is a being which is the least perfect being in the universe. So this putatively would be the devil, okay? A least perfect being, which doesn't exist, is even less perfect than one that does. Therefore, the least perfect being doesn't exist. So this is a reductio ad absurdum of the argument. If you can prove that, it just shows the argument spurious.
And the third question, please. Have you got somebody from up there? Let me just pass you that mic.
Hi. Oh, my name is Mr. Jones. My family are a very fundamentalist evangelical family, and they would argue that the evidence of God existing is the evidence in their own personal lives, experiences that they've had. And I remember, as an evangelical Christian, being told that's an argument that you can always say to people, because nobody can argue their own personal experience and that personal relationship that they have with God. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's true that the psychological conviction, if you really believed, for example, in the influence of the stars and planets on your destiny, if you really, really believed in it, then you would act accordingly, and it would be implicit, and it would be meaningful to you, and it would be the whole framework of your life. And similarly, if you're psychologically convinced about something or accept it, then you interpret everything accordingly. You know what they say? If your tool is a hammer, everything is a nail. So if your tool is you're an evangelical Christian, then everything conforms to your beliefs and expectations predicated on that. In Oxford, at Harris Manchester College in Oxford, there is a research centre. It's called the Religious Experience Research Centre. And it was set up by a very, very, very lovely man whom I had the privilege to know when I was a student at Oxford, a man called Sir Alister Hardy. He was a marine biologist. He's the one who came up with the idea that our forebears in the primate lineages must have spent a very long period on the Pliocene littorals, on the seashore, which is why we lost our body hair, whereas other primates haven't, why we've got subcutaneous fat as a way of, like other aquatic mammals have, why we have the diving reflex, the heart rate change that other aquatic mammals have. We have salty tears, which is what seagoing marine mammals have to exclude. And you may remember Elaine Morgan wrote a book called The Descent of Woman, which was predicated on the Hardy thesis about it. Her thesis was that we've got fat bottoms because we had to sit on pebbly beaches and they protect our other parts. But he set up this research centre, the Religious Experience Research Centre, because he was himself a man of, he was an Anglican of some faith. And I've read the reports of this. They accumulate, people send in religious experiences they've had. And what's sort of astonishing about them, because they're also like Fatima and, the appearance of the Virgin Mary to children and what have you, is the sort of banality of them. I mean, we would really like some answers about quantum theory and about the future and so on. And yet, when you read these reports, say, I was walking in Whiteham Woods and a voice said, you must visit your auntie next Saturday. And so on. You think, really? Well, I mean, if you're going to come down to earth and give us a message, tell us something interesting. That's what we'd really like to know. And the banality of them, and the fact that they are always within the limits of the imagination and experience of the person who has that experience. That's the interesting fact about them, which suggests that they are very, very much products of the psychology of the person in question.
And the next question, please. Is there somebody who was up quickly? That gentleman there. I'm going to rush to you with the mic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we need to be illusionists like Daniel Dennett to make sense of consciousness in a physicalist paradigm, or are there alternatives?
Oh, wow. Okay. Have you got breakfast organised, by the way?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. No.
Well, I have to say Dan Dennett, who is a personal friend and colleague of mine, he always used to say, by the way, something very well worth knowing. He used to say to my students when he came to visit my college, he would say, the weakest part of any argument is when you hear the word surely. Surely, and then you know that something's gone wrong with the argument. So it's well worth remembering that. Well, I'm not entirely sure that that I agree with Dan about the emergence of what look like or can be interpreted as conscious phenomena just from the the emergent properties from higher and higher levels of organization in the brain. So the idea that, and you can replicate to quite a large extent actually by very, very simple elements and simple sets of relationships between them in a computer program, you can get immense complexity out of that. We're very familiar with that phenomenon. And he attributes the appearance of conscious phenomena to that kind of emergence. I wonder whether that's so, because there is something very functional about consciousness. Even though most of our cognition is non-conscious, so we're processing information all the time at a non-conscious level, nevertheless, the organizational ability of conscious reflection, the use of memory, for example, selective awareness to things that really do matter, all that does seem to be sort of functional. And a very good example of this is the way that we all feel a little uneasy or maybe even startled when there's a rustle in the bushes as we're walking through the park at night. This is because in our evolutionary history, it would have been very wise to be alarmed just in case it was something that wanted to eat us. So this would be a reason for having evolved an ability to pay conscious, aware attention to selected aspects of our cognitive repertoire at any particular point. And that suggests that there is something that the brain is capable of integrating and being self-reflexive about some of the data that it's handling and processing all the time, which is a very good candidate for conscious experience. I remember once I had to lunch Frank Ramsey's young sister. Frank Ramsey, who tragically, he was a brilliant young man, died on the operating table at Guy's Hospital at the age of 26 in 1931, I think it was. And he had a much, much, much younger sister. She was fascinating because the Ramsey family lived in the president's lodgings at Magdalen College, Cambridge, because their father was the president of Magdalen College. And there was no small talk in that family. Never. They didn't talk about the weather or anything trivial. It was only about, proof theory and mathematics and, philosophy and probability and so on. And so she had no small talk, and she was therefore a rather difficult guest at lunch, as you can imagine. Anyway, we were sitting opposite this was when I was teaching in Oxford at St Anne's College, and she'd come as a guest, and we were sitting opposite a colleague of mine, a psychologist, who himself took a sort of rather Dineshian sort of view that there's no such thing as consciousness. There are only different cognitive modules separate for different functions. And I said to her, I said, he doesn't think that there is such a thing as consciousness. And she said, that's a very extraordinary view. And I thought, oh, great, I'm going to unleash her on him because she was terrifically sort of forensic and would really have a go at him. So I said, well, would you like to meet him and discuss this point? And she said, certainly not. I wouldn't understand his point of view, and nevertheless, I wouldn't agree with it, and that's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
And the next question, please. Is anybody up there who would like to ask a quick, you don't have to, but I'm just, going to leap up there if you know. Okay. Somebody over there.
Can
Yeah.
I ask, how do you think that your ideas about proof that you outlined this evening can be used to test contemporary political ideas?
Well, I think they apply directly. I mean, of course, we're all conscious of the fact that politics is an extremely difficult game. I mean, the one thing that what one can say, even about the very worst politicians and the worst political party in living memory and so on, is that, the metaphor of herding cats doesn't even come close to the difficulty of politics and of government. Because as society, we think falsely that there are majorities for anything in society. Societies are great collections of minorities and individuals, with lots and lots of competing interests and desires, projects, plans, needs, and therefore to govern in the interests of everybody is very difficult. So even a very well-intentioned government, a government which sees itself as having transcended politics, so that it's not just acting in the interests of its donors and supporters, but is really interested in the welfare of the country as a whole, has a very difficult time trying to meet all those interests and needs. And in any case, in a democracy or a sort of quasi-democracy like the one we nearly have here, is one that is characterized by noise, disagreement, arguments. Some years ago, I had the very, very great privilege to be one of a group of people sent by the United Nations Development Agency to Bhutan after the last king of Bhutan had, against the wishes of his people, made Bhutan a democracy. He had asked his courtiers to, that was a joke, but not true as well, being funny, his courtiers to make two little political parties and have an election, and then they had a government. And then the UN decided that there was going to be a conference with that government about the nature of democracy. And my little offering was, the sound of tyranny is silence. Now, the sound of democracy is noise, argument, disagreement, complaints, discussion, and that's therefore a sign of good health, that there is something which is healthy about a society where that does go on. We have a very unhealthy society at the moment, but there's a hell of a lot of noise, so maybe I wasn't wholly right about that particular point. Yes, to test, to prove, to subject to scrutiny, to ask challenging questions, and to look at the data, to look at the outcomes of applied government policies in their effect on the economy, on society, on great social institutions like the NHS and our education system and so on. There are plenty of opportunities to subject to test, to proof, whether or not our government is working, government policies are working, and whether our political order is genuinely being responsive and sensitive to the needs of the country.
Thank you very much.